we have had a series of asset bubbles. And by the way, the Federal Reserve, all they're trying to do, and this isn't just the Fed, European Central Bank, Japanese Bank, the rest of it, they're trying to reinflate the asset bubbles. Because when these things pop, the people who are in power lose power. And these people don't want to lose power because there's a lot of value in power. So they're going to try to keep this going as long as they can. But one day the music's going to stop. And the people what don't have chairs are going to be very, very sad pandas. All right? So where did it come from? Everything in life has a market price, okay? Money included. Whenever a central bank tries to determine the price of money, things will get misallocated. Back in the early 1980s, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates up to break the back of inflation. Then they started making money easier. And when you have a cost of money that is less than its market price, again, you will create distortions. In this country, essentially now for about the last 4 years, money has been free. Money was basically free back here. They started raising interest rates. The stock market got a little skittish. They dropped them back down again. A huge part of the problem we face as a country is the artificial manipulation of interest rates, the artificial manipulation of the cost of money by the Federal Reserve. In Japan, it's much worse. They have had money free in Japan now for about 16 years. By the way, it has not solved their problem. They are now embarking on a record flooding of the world with the Japanese yen that is going to end very badly for the people of Japan. I will give you some specifics on that a little bit later. But part of what drove our bubbles was the fact that you could get free money in Japan, but when you borrow money, you don't have to spend it in Japan. You could bring it to the United States. So all of this money that was being created in Japan, a lot of it ended up over here. This is part of what fueled our bubble. It's why China has been angry with us because money is so cheap here, but there's no one here to borrow it. So people borrow it here and they take it to China to invest, and that creates inflation problems there. Money is a worldwide phenomenon, and if any government increases the money supply significantly, that money can end up in places where it can cause problems. So part of what happened was Japanese had money cheaper than what it should have been in the market. We had money cheaper than it should have been in the market. That fed housing bubbles, internet bubbles, whatever we've had along the way. If we look at, in fact, what now has happened in Japan, and we effectively are on a very similar path to Japan. There are some differences demographically, but unfortunately not as many as we would really like. But you've had these artificially lower interest rates. How did Japan try to fight this? Okay, if you look at this chart, whenever you see these parabolic moves in stock prices, these are always unsustainable. They always end badly. You look at this and say the Japanese market was less than 10,000 back in the early 1980s. All of a sudden it goes up over 40,000 kind of in the 1990 time frame. And if you remember all of the conversation back then, it wasn't, holy cows, what a huge bubble we have in Japan. It was Japan, they were just smarter than we were. They worked harder. They had more savings. They did calisthenics before they went to work every day. And then somehow that was why the Japanese were just so superior to us. The reality is they had a huge real estate bubble, okay? If we look at what we did, we had the same pattern. And all we kept hearing was, well, this time it's different. Okay, it's a new economy. Okay, there is nothing new under the sun. Bubbles exist and bubbles burst and prices don't come back to bubble levels. Okay, you can again reinflate asset bubbles, but just very quickly, if you're familiar with tulip mania, okay, back in the 1600s, people decided that tulip bulbs were a good investment. I'm not making a word of this up if you haven't heard about this, okay? Tulip bulbs were selling, some of these rare bulbs, were selling for the equivalent of 10 years of wages. Okay? There were tulip bulbs that in today's dollars were selling for $250,000. And no one thought that that was weird somehow, okay? Because, well, this is the only one of these kinds of tulip bulbs. They will always go up in value. Well, believe it or not, the bubble burst. The price of tulip bulbs collapsed. Tulip bulbs today, and since the 1600s, have never gone back to $250,000, okay? It was, all bubbles operate on the greater fool theory, okay? It doesn't matter what you pay for anything. As long as there's at least one person dumber than you who will pay more than you did, you can buy it and make money. That's what happened in housing. It's what happened with internet stocks. Pets.com, for God's sakes, it was a sock puppet. That's all it was, okay? It was worth $1 billion. Why? Because somebody always knew they could sell it for more tomorrow than they paid for it today. And as long as the bubble continues, it works. But when the bubble goes bad, it goes bad quickly. If we overlay what happened in Japan and the United States, basically you had the same essential percentage moves. Now, we did a round of quantitative easing much larger and much faster. All the stimulus money, we did larger and faster. So you saw a divergence here. But once those ended, we came back down. You can only keep the game going as long as you can continue to dump money into it. Then we did a second round of quantitative easing. We'll talk about how that worked out. Japan is now effectively on its 9th round of quantitative easing. Okay? It hasn't worked. It can't work. Because you're trying to solve a collateral debt problem with liquidity, it's never going to work. I'll get into that in more detail in a bit. But essentially, if you say, well, why are you drawing a parallel to Japan? I'm drawing a parallel because you saw very similar bubbles. In fact, if you look at the different bubbles, in a 6-year period, their housing prices went up 50%, ours essentially doubled. But we're about 10 years behind them. Their stock market went up 200%, ours basically doubled. They have been doing rounds of deficit spending much larger than ours. Their debt to GDP is currently over 200%. It is the largest in the developed world. Now, they can continue to print yen, which is what they're doing, and that's what's keeping them alive, but there's no possibility they'll ever pay this money back. Japan will have to either hyperinflate or default or basically fall apart as a country. One of those things, it's the only outcome. We're at 100%, but when you add in our unfunded liabilities, we are in much, much worse shape. And we are never going to be able to make our payments either. We'll come into that. So, it's driven by excessive borrowing. Now, the chart I'm going to show you here, I've been using since 2007. This is one of the most important ideas, and it is a critical idea. Here's what it says. The blue bar is, this is what the government reports the GDP growth to be. So we were growing at kind of 3.6% maybe, something like that, 4.5%, whatever, all good stuff. The red bar is, here's what it would have been if people didn't use their houses as ATMs, if it wasn't for the mortgage equity withdrawals. And back here, we were still growing 3.5%. It was all good. But one of the things that you see is, in 2001 and 2002, if it wasn't for people using their houses as ATMs, we would have had a 2-year recession. Coming out of the recession, the government said everything's great. We're growing at 3.5%, 4% a year. It's wonderful. But if you take away the mortgage equity withdrawals, we were growing at 1% a year or less. What I used to try to say to people starting back in 2007 is, one day this has to end. One day people's houses will not keep going up in value. One day the bubble will burst. And when that day happens, it's not that the country is going to grow at 1%. All that money's got to get paid back. When that happens, you're looking at years, you're looking at decades of subpar growth, decades of recession. The reason the federal government is spending money at such a ridiculous rate right now is it's trying to make up for the fact that you can't use your house as an ATM anymore. All of the demand that you essentially sucked from the future, let me take a second on this, and this is an important idea, it's a complex idea. Unless you're going to leave debt to your children, you cannot over a lifetime spend more money than you earn, okay? So that means there's kind of a fixed amount of money that you're going to have coming in an income. Whether it's from a job, you own a business, stocks, whatever it may be, there's X amount of wealth out there. Any money that you borrow now is effectively counting against your future income, all right? So over a lifetime, let's say for the sake of argument, you're going to bring in $5 million. If you spend $10 million, someone's going to have a problem. And that someone's going to be your children, your grandchildren, whoever it may be. That's what happened here. We sucked a ton of demand from the future because we believed that our houses would go up in value forever, that houses weren't a place to live, houses were an investment, and we assumed that that money would keep coming in. When it stopped coming in, now we have a problem. And what we should be doing as an American people is paying down our debts. We should be increasing our savings. That is the only way we're going to solve this problem. To do that, however, will cause years of recession. It will be ugly. A lot of people will suffer. And the people in power don't want that to happen because, again, then you're not going to vote for them. But it's going to have to happen at some point. And the longer you push this off, the worse it's going to be when it happens. And this is again why I say that you can't sit this out. Everything that is coming, and it can take years, by the way. This doesn't have to happen in the next 15 minutes. I actually think a lot of this can probably go for another 10 and maybe another 15 years. And we'll talk about why and how they can keep it going. But when it hits, it's going to hit badly and it's going to end very, very badly. We have had a series of bubbles. We had them in the internet, housing, and commodities. All of these bubbles have burst. We're, by the way, trying to reinflate housing in the stock market, which will also reinflate commodities at some point. Currently, my view is we have bubbles in the Treasury and in the US dollar. Treasury yields for the amount of debt that we have are ridiculously low. They will have to go up. Now again, I'm not certain they have to go up in the next year. Okay, it could still be 2 years. But when they go up, they'll go up very quickly. I think bonds are a very dangerous place to be. We also have a budget bubble in college educations, but that's another story. So, we're running out of ways to keep the bubbles going. You can't take your interest rates any lower. Banks in the Federal Reserve System can borrow money from the Federal Reserve basically for 0.1%. You can't get the rates a whole lot lower than that. And by the way, this has been going on for years. There's no debt capacity. This is a really important idea. Okay, this is a balance sheet recession, which is very different than a standard recession. People say, well, we had this really bad recession, and after bad recessions, you get above average growth. We're obviously doing things wrong that we got below average growth. Now, they're right, we're doing things wrong, but the analogy is wrong. The balance sheet recession that you have today is a very, very rare phenomenon. It's much more akin to what happened in the 20s and the 1930s.